The espresso machine still steamed when they walked out laughing. Glass everywhere. Tables split like kindling. A 71-year-old woman stood in the wreckage of the cafe she'd built for 20 years. And she didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't reach for the phone. She just quietly wiped her hands on her apron and reached under the counter for something she hadn't touched in a very long time. What those men didn't know, what nobody in that town knew, was whose cafe they'd just destroyed. By sundown, 3 of them would understand. By the weekend, all of them would. Before we begin, I want to know something. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your town, your state, your country in the comments below. This story is going to travel far, to good people in small towns and big cities all over, and I want to see just how far it reaches. So tell me where you're tuning in from, and let's fill that comment section before we go a single step further, because this is a story about a woman the whole world underestimated. They saw an old widow in an apron, alone in a fading town, pouring coffee for strangers and asking for nothing. They saw someone easy, someone who would pay and stay quiet and never fight back. They saw the perfect target, they saw all of that, and they missed the one thing that mattered. They had no idea who she used to be. And by the time they found out, it was already far, far too late. This is that story. There's a cafe at the end of Voss Street, in a town that most maps have stopped bothering to name. The steel mill closed a generation ago and took the crowds with it. So the sidewalks are quiet now, and the buildings wear their years openly. But every morning before the sun clears the rooftops, one light comes on. A small light, warm and yellow, spilling out through a fogged front window onto the cracked pavement. And behind that window, an old woman is already moving. Her name is Delphine, though nobody has called her that in years. To this town she is simply Del. She is 71 years old, a widow, and she has poured coffee in this room for the better part of 2 decades. Her hands are weathered and sure. She knows the exact weight of a full pot without looking, knows which floorboard size beneath the 3rd table, knows the rhythm of this place, the way you know your own breathing, and the people know her. There is the retired school teacher who takes the window seat every morning and lingers over a single cup until noon, because home is empty and here is not. There is the young father, exhausted and proud, who orders 1 coffee and somehow always leaves with a sandwich he never paid for, because Del has decided his boy will not go hungry on her watch. And there is the old soldier in the corner, who speaks to no one in this world but her. This is not just a cafe. It is the last warm room in a cold town. It is a place where the forgotten are remembered. And that, of course, is exactly what made it worth taking. Now, before we go any further, before you meet the men who walked into that warm room and decided it belonged to them, I want to ask you for something small. Because in a moment, everything you just came to love about this place is going to be threatened. The peace of it, the kindness of it, the quiet dignity of an old woman who asked the world for nothing except the chance to keep pouring coffee for the people it had forgotten. If you already believe a woman like Del deserves to be left alone, if something in you has already decided you're on her side, then do me one favor. Reach down and hit that subscribe button right now. Here's why it matters, and I mean this. Men like the ones you're about to meet don't get away with what they do because they're strong. They get away with it because they're counting on something. They're counting on no one watching. They're counting on the old and the alone being invisible, on nobody caring enough to look twice, on the whole thing happening in the dark where kindness has no witnesses. That silence is the only weapon they've ever really had. So let's take it from them. Every single subscriber is one more person refusing to look away, one more witness in a story these men wanted to keep quiet. This channel exists for one reason. It is the place where the good ones win, where the forgotten are remembered and the cowards finally answer for it. Subscribe, stand with her, and then stay right here, because they're about to walk through that door. The first time they came, it was a Friday. It's almost always a Friday, with men like these. They understand the shape of a small business, the way the week fills the register and the weekend empties it. They come when the drawer is heaviest, and they come when they know a tired woman is thinking about closing up, about her aching feet, about the long, quiet evening ahead. They study these things. It is the one form of intelligence they possess. He came through the door a little after 4, and the bell above it rang the same cheerful note it always did. The note it had rung for every friend and stranger for 20 years. But the man who stepped underneath it did not belong to that sound. His name was Roal Vecker, and he filled the doorway the way bad weather fills a sky. He was broad and unhurried, dressed a little too well for a town this poor, and he wore the particular smile of a man who has never once been told no. Behind him came 2 others, younger, harder around the eyes, saying nothing. They didn't need to. Their job was simply to stand and to be large, and to let the quiet do the work. Dell felt it before she understood it. Anyone would have. There is a kind of cold that walks into a warm room, and every soul inside that cafe felt the temperature change. The school teacher looked up from her window seat. The young father's hand went still around his cup, and in the corner, the old soldier, the one who spoke to no one, lifted his eyes and did not lower them. Vecker didn't look at any of them. He looked at Dell. He crossed the floor slowly, taking his time, letting his gaze travel over the shelves and the little handwritten menu and the framed photographs on the wall as though he were pricing the place. And then he reached the counter, and he laid one heavy hand flat upon the register, just laid it there. He didn't open it. He didn't have to. He simply rested his palm on top of it, gently, the way a man might rest his hand on something he already considered his own. "Nice little place," he said, and he smiled that smile that wasn't a smile. Be a shame if something happened to it. That was all. That was the whole speech. It didn't need to be more. He explained the arrangement in a low, friendly voice, the way you might explain the weather. There were, he said, people in this part of town who looked out for businesses like hers, kept them safe, kept the windows whole and the troublemakers away, and such a service naturally had a cost. A modest cost. A weekly one. He named a figure, and it was not modest at all. It was a wound. A number that would bleed her thin over time. But he named it the way you name a small favor between friends. And Dell paid. She opened the drawer with steady hands, because she was too proud to let them shake in front of him, and she counted out the money, and she set it on the counter. Vecker took it without counting, folded it once, and slid it into his coat. He tapped the register twice with 2 fingers, a little farewell, and told her he'd see her next Friday. Then he turned and walked out into the failing light, and his 2 silent shadows followed, and the bell rang its cheerful note behind them, and the cold walked out with them. The cafe breathed again. Somebody exhaled. The school teacher asked if she was all right, and Dell said yes, of course, don't you worry. And she managed a smile, and she began wiping down a counter that was already clean. But here is what mattered. Here is the thing to hold on to. He came back the next Friday, and the figure was higher. And the Friday after that, higher still, because that is how it works with men like Roal Vecker. They do not take once. They take a little more each time, testing, always testing, to find the edge of what a person will endure, never once imagining that some people have no edge at all. And so the weeks passed, and the wound grew wider. Every Friday the number climbed. Never by much. Vecker was too clever for that, too patient. He raised it the way you turn up a flame beneath a pot, so gradually that the water never knows it's boiling until it's too late. A little more this week for a new expense he'd invented. A little more the next, because times were hard, he said. And everyone had to do their part. And every Friday, Dell opened the drawer and counted it out. And every Friday, there was less left behind when the bell rang and the cold walked out the door. She began, quietly, to go without. It started small, the way surrender always does. She stopped ordering the good coffee for herself and drank the bitter dregs at the bottom of the pot. She let the heating run low in the back rooms and wore an extra sweater against the chill. And then, when even that wasn't enough, she began skipping the little white pills the doctor had told her she must take every single day without fail. They were expensive, those pills, and the pharmacy did not extend the same friendly credit that Roal Vecker did. So she stretched them. One every other day, then one every third. She told herself she felt fine. She told herself it didn't matter. An old woman learns to lie to herself gently, the way she lies to everyone else. But you cannot hide everything, not in a room full of people who love you. The school teacher noticed first. Noticed the silence that had settled over Dell like dust, the way the light had gone out of her, the way she flinched. Now, whenever the bell above the door rang on a Friday afternoon, she saw the bruised, worn-down quiet of a woman being slowly emptied. And the old soldier saw it too. He had watched the whole thing unfold from his corner, week after week, saying nothing, because saying nothing was all he did anymore. But one evening, after the last customer had gone, he rose from his chair and crossed to the counter, and in a voice rough from disuse, he offered, simply, plainly, to handle it. Dell looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes, something old and careful, and full of a meaning he could not read. And then she reached out, laid her weathered hand over his, and said, very softly, "No, not you." That night, after the old soldier had gone home, Dell locked the front door and turned the sign in the window, and for a long while she simply stood alone in the dark of the empty cafe, listening to the quiet. Then she went to the back. There was a drawer there, in the bottom of an old desk in the little room behind the kitchen. A drawer she kept locked. A drawer she had not opened in years. Not on birthdays. Not on the long anniversary nights when the loneliness pressed hardest. Not once in all the time this town had known her. She kept the key on a chain she never took off, tucked beneath her collar, close to the skin, close to the heart. And on this night, for the first time in a very long time, she drew it out. The lock turned with a small, reluctant sound. Inside, wrapped in cloth gone soft with age, lay the pieces of another life. A photograph, its colors faded, of people young and fierce and alive. A single embroidered patch, its threads worn, but its meaning unmistakable to anyone who had ever known that world. And beneath them both, folded with a care that bordered on reverence, a vest, dark leather, creased and scarred, bearing colors this quiet town had never seen and would not have believed. Dell looked at these things for a long moment. Her hand hovered above them, trembling, not with fear now, but with memory. And then, gently, she closed the drawer and locked it. She was not ready. Not yet. But that Friday, they didn't come to collect. They came to send a message. And the message was going to be written all over the floor of the only home she had left. They came late that Friday, later than usual, when the light had already gone and only the regulars remained. The school teacher, the young father, the old soldier in his corner. The bell rang its cheerful note, and this time Vecker did not smile at all. He didn't cross to the counter. He stopped in the middle of the room, looked around slowly at the little warm world Dell had built, and then he gave the smallest nod to the two men behind him, and they began to destroy it. The first table went over with a crash that seemed to split the air. Then the second. A chair was lifted and driven down against the floor, until the legs broke away. They swept the shelves clean with their forearms, and the framed photographs, 20 years of faces, of Christmases, of small ordinary joys, came down in a rain of shattered glass. The register was thrown from the counter. The good cups, the ones Dell washed by hand each night, exploded against the tile, one after another, after another. The young father surged to his feet and was shoved back down. The schoolteacher was screaming. And through all of it, the noise and the ruin and the breaking of everything she had, Dell did not move. She stood behind her counter, very still, and she watched them tear her life apart. When it was done, when the floor was a wreckage of glass and splintered wood, Vecker walked to her at last. He leaned in close, so close she could feel his breath, and in a low and pleasant voice, he told her that this was a warning, that the price had just gone up again, and that if she was ever late, ever short, ever foolish enough to think about going to anyone for help, the next time, they wouldn't trash the place. The next time, he said, they'd burn it. With her inside it, if that's what it took. Then he straightened his coat, and he and his men walked out into the dark, and the bell rang its cheerful note over the ruin they left behind. For a long moment no one spoke. The school teacher was weeping. The young father knelt in the broken glass and begged her, "Please, Dell, please. We have to call the police. We have to call someone." Dell looked down at the wreckage of 20 years, and something in her face had changed. The fear was gone. In its place was something older, and colder, and very, very still. "The police can't help with men like this," she said quietly, "but I know who can. I have to stop for just a moment, because if you're anything like me, watching that made your blood boil." An old woman, standing in the wreckage of everything she built, threatened with fire in the one place she called home. Men like Vecker do this precisely because they believe no one will ever make them answer for it. So let's send a signal they understand. Comment, "Not on my watch," down below if you believe people who terrorize the vulnerable should never, ever get away with it. And here's why it matters. Every single comment tells YouTube to carry this story further, to more people, to more witnesses. The more who see how this ends, the better. Do it now. Then stay right here with me. Because what she does next, nobody saw it coming. That night, Dell sent them all home. The school teacher, the young father, the old soldier. She thanked them, and she promised them she was all right. And one by one, she guided them out through the broken door into the dark. And when the last of them was gone, and she was alone again in the ruin of her cafe, she did not begin to clean. Instead, she went to the back room, to the old desk. And beside that locked drawer, on the shelf above it, there sat a telephone. Not the kind you carry in your pocket. An old one, black and heavy, with a rotary dial that clicked and whirred as it turned. It had sat there gathering dust for as long as anyone could remember, and most who saw it assumed it no longer worked at all. It worked. Dell lifted the receiver, and she dialed a number she had never once written down. A number that lived only in her memory, in that same locked place where the photograph and the patch and the vest had waited all these years. The dial turned and clicked its way home, 7 times, and somewhere far away, a phone began to ring. Someone answered, and Dell said one sentence into the receiver. Just one. We do not hear what it was. But when she finished speaking, she set the phone gently back in its cradle, and she stood in the dark, and for the first time in weeks, she was not afraid. Because hundreds of miles away, in another state entirely, that single sentence had just landed, like a stone in still water. Picture the place where it landed. A low building at the edge of a highway, windows dark, a row of motorcycles gleaming out front beneath a buzzing light. Inside, a room full of men. Hard men, dangerous men, the kind of men most people cross the street to avoid. Men who had spent their whole lives being feared by others. There was music, and noise, and the easy, loud laughter of people who answer to no one. And then the one who had taken the call set the phone down, and he spoke a name. The room went quiet, not slowly, all at once. The laughter died in their throats. The music seemed to fade into the background. Every head turned. These men, who feared nothing and no one, who had built their entire lives on being the most dangerous thing in any room they entered. These men fell silent at the sound of a single name, and on more than one weathered, scarred face, there was something you would never in 1,000 years have expected to see. There was reverence, and underneath it, just barely, something close to fear. One of them finally spoke, his voice low. "You're sure?" he said. "You're sure it was her?" The man who had taken the call only nodded, and without another word, they began to rise. Now hold on to this, because this is the thing that changes everything. The men who trashed that cafe thought they were the most frightening thing this town had ever seen. They thought a frail old widow, alone and unprotected, was the easiest prey in the world. They had no idea at all. They hadn't robbed a helpless old woman. They had kicked over an anthill, and they had chosen the deadliest one alive. To understand why those men rose from their chairs, you have to understand who Dell used to be. Not the widow in the apron, not the woman who slips free sandwiches to a tired young father. Someone else. Someone from a long time ago. 30-some years back. Before this town. Before the cafe. Before the quiet. There was a woman on a motorcycle, riding at the front of a long line of them. And that woman was her. She was younger then, of course. But it was more than youth. She rode like she owned the road, and everything the road touched. And the men around her, the same world those hard men in that far-off clubhouse still belonged to, did not follow her because they had to. They followed her because there was something in her they had never seen in anyone else. A steadiness. A nerve that did not break. A code she lived by so completely that it bent the people around her into line. She earned a name in that world. A real one. The kind that traveled ahead of her into rooms she hadn't entered yet. The kind that made hard men sit up a little straighter. She was not feared because she was cruel. That was never it. The cruel ones are forgotten. She was feared because she was fair, and because she was absolutely without fear herself, and because everyone understood, down to the marrow, that there was a line you did not cross with her. Those who crossed it learned. Those who didn't cross it made very sure they never would. The photograph in that locked drawer was from those days. The faces in it, young and fierce and alive, were her family, closer than blood, bound by something the ordinary world has no word for. The patch was her name made into thread, and the vest, that dark and scarred leather, was everything she had been. So why did she leave it? Why does a woman like that walk away from a world that would have followed her anywhere, and trade it for an apron and a coffee pot in a town nobody remembers? Because that world takes things. It always takes something in the end, and what it took from her was the one person she could not live without losing. The details belong to her, and we will not pry them open here. But know this, there was a loss so deep that it hollowed her out, a grief that no amount of nerve or reputation could stand against. And standing over that loss, she understood, finally, the true price of the life she'd led. She had earned a name that could silence a room, and it could not bring back the one thing she wanted. So she put the vest in a drawer. She locked it, and she rode away from all of it, to a quiet street at the end of a dying town, where nobody knew her name and nobody ever would. She poured coffee. She grew old. She chose peace, not because she was weak, but because peace had cost her everything, and she was never going to let it go. For 20 years, she kept that promise. She stayed gone. And then 3 small men, who understood nothing of what they were doing, reached into her one place of peace and dragged all of it back into the light. At first, it was nothing you could point to, just small wrongnesses, the kind of thing a man shrugs off without a second thought. A supplier who had done business with Vecker's crew for years, a man who moved certain goods, asked no questions, and always answered his phone, suddenly stopped answering it. And when Vecker finally reached him, the man was strange, distant, said he couldn't work with them anymore. Wouldn't say why, just that he'd had a conversation, and after that conversation, he'd decided the arrangement was over. He hung up quickly, and he did not call back. Then there was the cousin. One of the younger men in the crew had a cousin 2 towns over, and that cousin got a visit. Nobody laid a hand on him. Nobody made a threat you could repeat to the police. 2 men simply came to his door, and they were polite, and they mentioned the crew by name, and they asked a few quiet questions, and then they left. But the cousin called that same night, badly shaken, wanting to know what in God's name these boys had gotten themselves into. Small things. A door that used to open now closed. A number that used to answer now didn't. A feeling, creeping in at the edges, that somewhere out of sight the ground had begun to shift. And there was one man in that crew who felt it before all the others. Sten Brugge was the money behind Vecker, the quiet one, the careful one, the one who counted the take and kept the books and never once got his own hands dirty. Brugge had survived a long time in an ugly business, and he had survived it by paying attention, by trusting the cold prickle at the back of his neck when something was wrong. And now that prickle would not leave him. He didn't know what it was, He couldn't name it, but he knew the shape of trouble the way an old sailor knows the shape of a coming storm, and every instinct he had was screaming at him that a storm was coming. He brought it to Vecker, told him something was off, told him maybe, just maybe, the old woman at the cafe was more than she looked. And Vecker laughed at him. She was a frightened old widow in an apron, he said. She'd paid every week without a word. What was she going to do? Bake them to death? He brushed it all aside, and he poured himself a drink, and he never once considered that his careful partner might be the only man in the room who was right. But here is what Vecker didn't know. Here is what even Brugge himself hadn't yet understood. That his fear wasn't just instinct, it was memory. Old memory, buried so deep he'd nearly convinced himself it wasn't real. Because Sten Brugge had a history, and it was a history he had spent the better part of 2 decades running from. Long ago, before he was the careful money man counting a small-town cruise protection take, Brugge had moved in a bigger and far more dangerous world, the very world Dell had once ruled. He'd been on the edges of it, never truly inside, always looking for the angle, the shortcut, the way to take a little more than his share. And one day he had done exactly that. He had crossed the wrong people. He had taken money that wasn't his to take, from an organization that did not forgive that kind of thing, and then he had done the only sensible thing a man in his position could do. He ran. He changed the towns he worked in. He changed the company he kept. He made himself small, and he made himself quiet, and he built a modest little life preying on people too weak to chase him, because weak people don't come looking. For years it worked. For years he told himself the debt was old, forgotten, buried with everyone who might remember it. He was wrong. That world does not forget. And the name at the very top of it, the name that debt had truly been owed to, all those years ago, belonged to a woman he had walked past a dozen times without ever once looking twice. She poured his coffee. She'd probably smiled at him. And Sten Brugge, who had hidden from her kind for half his life, had no idea that he had been hiding, all this time, right in the shadow of the very person he feared most. He was about to find out. And before he does, before this all comes down, I need to know something. I need to know you're on the right side of this. Because we are getting close now. The men who trashed that cafe, who threatened to burn an old woman alive inside the only home she had left, who built their whole miserable little empire on the belief that money makes you untouchable, and the weak will never fight back. Those men are about to learn how wrong they were. And I want you there when it happens. So if you can't stand bullies who prey on the vulnerable, if it turns your stomach the way it turns mine, do this right now. Hit subscribe. Turn on the bell. It costs you nothing, and it does something these cowards never expected. It puts one more witness in the room. One more person who refused to look away, one more person standing on the right side of the line. They never thought anyone would fight back. They never imagined a whole audience of people watching, waiting, rooting for the old woman in the apron. They counted on the dark, and on the silence, and on no one caring. Let's prove them wrong. Every single one of us. Subscribe, and stand with her, and let's finish this together. Because it's almost time. For days after the cafe, a question had been eating at Roald Vecker, though he was far too proud to admit it out loud. He'd noticed the small wrongnesses too by now. The supplier who wouldn't answer, the cousin who'd been visited, Brugge's nerves, fraying a little more each day. And though he laughed it all off, though he told anyone who'd listen that the old woman was nothing, somewhere underneath that swagger, a smaller, colder voice had begun to whisper a single question. Who had she called? Because he knew, deep down, that she had called someone. He'd seen it in her face that last night. The moment the fear left her, and something else took its place. That stillness, that certainty. It had unsettled him more than he would ever say. A frightened woman he understood. A calm one, standing in the ruins of everything she owned, and not the least bit afraid. That was something he could not explain, and the things Roald Vecker could not explain were the only things in this world that frightened him. He wanted to know who she'd called. On Saturday morning, he found out. Because it turned out that Vecker and his crew were not the only men in this story who could park a dozen motorcycles outside a person's front door. They were not the only ones who could arrive without warning, fill a quiet street with the low thunder of engines, and let their sheer presence deliver a message no words could match. They had done it to an old woman. Now someone was about to do it to them, and for the first time in his life, it was Roval Vecker's turn to be afraid. They came with the sunrise. The people of that dying town would talk about it for years afterward, the morning they woke to a sound they had never heard before. It began as a low murmur on the horizon, far off, easy to mistake for distant weather, but it grew, and it grew, and within minutes, it had swelled into a deep, rolling thunder that rattled the windows in their frames and pulled sleepers from their beds to press their faces against the glass. It was the sound of engines, many of them, moving together in formation with a discipline that turned raw noise into something almost like music. And then they came around the bend at the top of Voss Street, and the whole town saw them, a long line of motorcycles, riding 2 by 2, filling the road from curb to curb. The men on them did not shout. They did not rev their engines or wave weapons, or make any of the noise that small, frightened men make when they want to seem dangerous. They didn't need to. There was nothing frightened about them. They rode slow and straight and utterly certain, and the sheer weight of their presence pressed down on that street like a change in the air before a storm. This was not chaos. This was the opposite of chaos. This was control, cold, absolute, disciplined control, and every soul who watched it understood, instinctively, that they were looking at the real thing. For weeks, Roel Vecker and his crew had played at this. They had parked their handful of bikes outside frightened people's homes and imagined themselves lords of it. They had swaggered into a coffee shop and mistaken an old woman's silence for weakness and their own cruelty for strength. Now the genuine article had arrived, and the difference between the two was the difference between a boy in his father's coat and the man that coat was made for. They rode straight to the place where Vecker and his men had gathered, and they filled the street outside it, engine after engine after engine, until the entire block belonged to them. Then, one by one, the engines went silent, and into that enormous, ringing quiet, the men dismounted. Inside, Vecker's crew had gone very still. They had heard it coming, of course. Everyone in town had heard it coming, and they had crowded to the windows with their swagger already draining out of them, watching that endless line of bikes fill the road, doing the terrible arithmetic, a handful of them against all of that. Brygge's face had gone gray. He knew. He had known for days that a storm was coming, and now he could see it, parked bumper to bumper the length of the street, and some part of him understood that it had come for him longest of all. And Vecker, who had laughed, who had brushed it all aside, who had promised to burn an old woman alive inside her own cafe, Vecker stood frozen at the window, and the color left his face, and the swagger drained out of him like water out of a cracked glass. The door opened, and they came in. They did not rush, they did not shout. They filed in slowly, filling the room, and there were so many of them that Vecker's men shrank back against the walls without a single word being spoken. The air itself seemed to grow heavy, and the man at the front of them, older, scarred, with eyes that had seen every ugly thing this world has to offer, walked straight up to Roel Vecker and stopped an arm's length away. He said nothing for a long moment. He simply looked at him, looked at the man who had terrorized an old woman, threatened her home, laughed at the very idea that anyone would ever make him answer for it. And in that silence, Vecker understood exactly how badly he had misjudged everything. The most feared man in that room was suddenly the most frightened. His hands were shaking, his breath had gone shallow, and every person watching, every regular who had wept in that cafe, every soul in that town who had learned to dread a Friday afternoon, would have given anything to see the look on his face, because the reckoning had come, and it had her name on it. And this is the moment everyone expected the violence to begin. The setup was perfect for it. A room full of hard men, a pack of cowards backed against the wall, A debt that could only be paid one way. Every instinct the story had built said that Roel Vecker was about to receive, in full and with interest, exactly what he had given. But that is not what happened, because at that moment, the door opened one more time, and Dell walked in. She came in slowly, an old woman in a plain coat, and the sea of hard men parted for her without a word, and she crossed the room to stand in front of the man who had trashed her cafe and promised to burn her alive inside it. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did the one thing no one in that room, least of all Vecker, was prepared for. She chose mercy. Not because she was weak. She had, standing behind her, the power to erase him from the face of the earth, and every man in that room knew it, and so did he. She chose it because she had already lived the other life. She knew exactly where the road of taking and breaking and burning led, because she had walked it to its end, and it had cost her the only thing she ever truly loved. She had buried a piece of herself to get free of that world, and she was not going to dig it back up for the likes of Roel Vecker, so she gave him a choice instead. One chance. Make right what he had broken, and leave this town, and never come back, or refuse, and let the men behind her do what men like them do. She said it quietly, and she said it once, and Vecker, shaking, understood that the mercy she was offering was the only mercy he would ever get. As for Brugge, she needed to do nothing to him at all. His debt was old, and it had a name, and now the men who held it knew exactly where he was. His own past would collect him. It always had been going to. He had simply forgotten, for a while, that it was coming. And in that moment, standing small and calm among all those dangerous men, Dell was the most powerful person in the room. Not because she was the most frightening, but because she was the only one there strong enough not to become what they were. That is a strength the cruel will never understand. And in the days that followed, everything Dell had set in motion quietly came to pass. Sten Brugge was the first to go. The careful money man, the one who had spent half his life running, who had built his whole small existence on staying invisible. His invisibility was gone now, stripped away in a single morning. The men who held his old debt knew his name, knew his face, knew the very street he'd been hiding on. He did not wait around to see what they would do with it. He was gone within the day, leaving behind the books and the take and the modest little life he'd scraped together, running once again, the way he had always run. But he was older now, and slower, and the world he'd wronged had a very long memory. Wherever he went, that debt would follow. His past had finally caught up with him, and it was never going to let go again. Vecker's crew fell apart without their money and their menace to hold them together. The younger men, who had felt so large standing behind a broken old register, scattered like the small things they'd always been, the moment there was real danger in the air. Some simply vanished from the town overnight. Others found that their reputation, the thing they'd traded their souls for, had turned to ash. Word travels in that world, and the word was out now. These were the men who had terrorized an old woman under the protection of a name they never knew, and there is no faster way to become nothing in that life than that. Their own kind's code had turned against them. Doors that once opened for them slammed shut. The fear they had traded on for so long now belonged entirely to someone else, and Vecker himself took the mercy he was offered, because the alternative had been made very clear to him. He made right what he could. He paid back what he could pay, repaired what could be repaired, and then he left, and he did not come back, and this town never saw him again. The protection racket that had squeezed the life out of Voss Street was finished. Simply, completely finished. And the town, which had learned to hold its breath every Friday afternoon, finally let it out. You could feel it in the air. In the days that followed, a whole small community exhaling at once, waking to a morning with nothing to be afraid of for the first time in a very long while. And so, in the quiet that followed, the little cafe at the end of Voss Street came back to life. It did not come back alone. It came back the way everything worth having comes back, carried by the hands of the people who love it. The young father was there before Dell had even asked, sleeves rolled up, sweeping the broken glass, hauling out the splintered wood. The schoolteacher came with a basket of supplies and a fierce determination to see her window seat restored exactly as it had been. Neighbors who had only ever been customers arrived with hammers and paint and quiet resolve. And in his corner, the old soldier worked steadily alongside the rest, saying little, as always, but there, present, giving what he had to give. Piece by piece, they put it back together. The tables were mended or replaced. The shelves went back up on the walls. New glass caught the morning light again, and the framed photographs, those that had survived, and new ones besides, found their places once more. And in time, the little cafe was whole again. More than whole. It had been broken. And the breaking had shown Dell something she had perhaps forgotten in all her years of pouring coffee for strangers. That she was not, and never had been, truly alone. The window seat waited for the schoolteacher every morning. The young father still somehow left with a sandwich he never paid for. The old soldier still spoke to no one but her. The last warm room in a cold town was warm again. And late one evening, after the others had gone home, and the cafe was quiet and hers, Dell went to the back room one final time. She drew out the key she wore against her heart, and she turned it in the lock, and she opened the drawer she had opened only once in 20 years. She looked, for a long moment, at the faded photograph, at the young and fierce and living faces, at the patch and the scarred leather beneath it, at everything she had been, and everything it had cost her. And then, gently, she folded the cloth back over them, and she closed the drawer. But this time it was different. This time there was no fear in it, and no running from anything. She was not hiding that life away in shame or in sorrow. She was simply setting it down, at last, and choosing, freely, and with a whole heart, the one she had built here instead. She had chosen this life on purpose, and this time, she got to keep it. The men who trashed her cafe believed two things. They believed no one was watching, and they believed no one would care. You just proved them wrong on both counts, simply by staying to the very end. So here is the last thing I'll ask of you. Comment "She earned her piece" down below. Let's fill that comment section with people who believe the vulnerable deserve protecting, and that bullies deserve exactly what they get. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that the good ones still win. And if you haven't yet, subscribe, because every story on this channel ends just like this one, with people like Dell standing tall. The cowards of this world want silence. They always have. Let's give them the exact opposite. She poured coffee for 20 years and asked for nothing in return. She built a warm room at the end of a cold street, and she filled it with kindness, and she gave shelter to the forgotten, and she never once asked the world to notice. And when that same world came to take even that small piece from her, when it reached into the one quiet corner she had left and tried to break it, she did not beg, and she did not run. She reminded it, quietly and completely, exactly who she was. And then, when it was over, when the danger had passed, and the storm had rolled back out to wherever storms go, she did the only thing left for a woman like her to do. She tied her apron on again, and she put the kettle back on.